Hello and welcome to the Three Little Pigs podcast, except not so much anymore. We've decided to rebrand Three Little Pigs because nobody knows what the fuck Three Little Pigs means. So we are just going to rename our podcast, especially since we have like 3 listeners, so it doesn't really matter at this point. We are now the Like Iron podcast. So get used to it. We're trying to do it regularly. All right, so welcome to the new and improved and hopefully somewhat regular Like Iron podcast. My name's Shannon.
I'm Jackson.
I'm Wes.
And today we are going to talk all things training efficiency and training on a time crunch and basically just training around your life when life kind of gets in the way because we can't all be professional powerlifters like myself. But before we get to that topic, we are going to answer a question from a listener, one of our few. His name is Marcus Payne. Shout out to Marcus. He works at NASA. His question is, with how much misinformation, bro science, etc. is going around, how do you deal with casually hearing people spout lifting nonsense? Do you try to tiptoe around mansplaining and teach people something, or just let it be? Shannon has had a decade of correcting Dan and I. Dan is one of my best friends. Regarding what we learn on bodybuilding.com forums, but it's cool since we're friends. I may say a bunch of swear words at him, but I also take the advice. So, basically the question is, when we see idiocy in a gym or people spout nonsense about fitness that we kind of know about, do we give them advice? Do we correct them?
I think at least my philosophy on this is if someone asks, then you can give your opinion. But if no one asks, I don't want to be the guy who just goes around all self-righteous trying to tell people what they're doing wrong and correcting everything. We own a gym, and I think when I first started, I thought, that may be a good idea, but just over time realized that no one really cares unless they ask. And so if someone asks, then I'll get into an in-depth conversation with them. If not, and they're just minding their own business, I'll just let them be.
Yeah, I think they don't care at all about what you have to think. And from a gym owner standpoint and a trainer standpoint, that's a terrible way to initiate a sale, especially. The first interaction you have is unsolicited training information from someone that they have no idea who you are, your pedigree, or you don't even know what they're training for. So who really cares? If they ask for it, yes. If they're paying me 100%, but if I just see someone training, even at my gym, and it looks wrong, I'm not going to correct it unless they directly ask me.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement here. I only give advice if I'm asked. I definitely went through a stage, I think it was in high school, my freshman year of college, probably just high school, where I thought, I was the bee's knees and I knew everything, and I definitely gave people advice. And if I heard something stupid, I would correct them, but nobody likes that asshole. Don't be that asshole. And generally, if you are that asshole, you don't know as much as you think you know. So yeah, I only give advice if asked. Nobody likes, especially if you see a girl lifting, don't try to go over and give them advice. You just look like a douche. As far as my friends, sometimes I'll call them stupid if they're talking stupid.
That's different, though, if in a conversation. If somebody brings up something, if we're already talking, and they say, I'm doing this because X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z is obviously wrong, then I'll come in and kind of,
yeah. If you have a rapport with somebody, then sometimes you can bring up topics like that. But if it's just a stranger doing their thing, like you guys said, you have no context of what they're doing or why they're doing it, and you're seeing a snapshot of what they're doing, not the whole thing. So there's no point in judging, and you're never going to convince them on your way, especially if you come off as just an all-knowing asshole, which you're not.
Yeah, I think you're going to get some pushback from that too, because in your own mind you might be thinking that you're helping someone, but you're just doing a disservice because now you come off, like Shannon said, as an asshole, and then in the future, when you do try to give advice, this person might not want to listen at all, and so you might not be doing yourself any favors in the long run.
Yeah. And oftentimes it's the opposite. If you try to correct them, they're just going to dig in deeper.
Yeah.
So let's move on to this topic. So basically, we're going to talk about how to train when you don't have as much time as you would like to train. And we're all very familiar with this now, as two of us are in grad school, and one of us just had a baby, and also has a job, and also goes to school. So if anything's going to affect how much you train, it's going to be those three things together, especially the baby. So I guess we'll just start by talking about like strategies and how we go about it. I'm sure we've all made mistakes in like how we've programmed. We've tried to like do it by trial and error. I think Jackson had a lot of good things to say, so we'll let him talk first.
Yeah. So when my son Cal was born, it was actually the first 4 weeks were some of the most productive training that I had. And what I did was I didn't have a set training plan at all. I had essentially a checklist with volume that I was trying to hit for certain RPEs throughout the week. So for example, I'd say, okay, you have to bench twice, you have to squat twice, you have to deadlift once, and you have to do a deadlift variation once. Accessory, you pick one accessory for the day, and it was normally like a row variation or chin ups or something like that. But I only had 45 minutes to train, and I was training somewhere between 2 to 6 times a week. It really completely depended. So, I could have done everything on that checklist in one day, or I could have done one thing on the checklist that day. And as long as I hit my total volume throughout the week, I considered it a successful training plan. And then after that 4 weeks, I tried to get back on more of a scheduled training cycle, and things have kind of fallen off the wagon a little bit. Because it's hard if I look at my training plan and I'm like, okay, I've got 4 exercises planned for the day. Here's my volume that I'm going to hit. Here's the RPE I'm going to hit. I'm going to try to work up to this top set. What happens is that I end up going over the allotted time, and then I feel like I failed that training session, or like that training session wasn't as valuable as it could be, just considering that I didn't hit everything that I had prescribed for myself. So that was kind of my thought process. I've gone back to the checklist style of training now that I'm really busy, and I auto-regulate a lot of it with the RPE that I'm using for that day.
Yeah, I think one strategy that I had to implement this year starting grad school was I actually lowered my total training frequency, but left my volume the same, because I had 3 days where I could have bigger bouts of training, and I just didn't have the time or to have higher frequency. So what I did was combined those 4 sessions that I was originally doing into 3 sessions, and those 3 sessions were just longer, but I could make it work on certain days. And then what I also did on those days is I set, similar to what Jackson said, a time cap, but the time cap was actually in between rest from each movement. And so, usually if I'm not on a time crunch, I won't necessarily set a specific time in between each set. But this go around this semester, I set like 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll just go right into the next set. I still used RPE like I usually do, but just lower frequency, and had kind of time limits in between sets. And then if I had to, I would superset. I would try to superset opposing movements or muscle groups or something, just to get some additional work in and a given amount of time. So those kind of the strategies I had to implement this semester, and it worked out fairly well. It just allowed me to get my training in.
Yeah, this is why it's interesting, because there's a lot of like personalized ways you can do it to try to save time. Like, I think you need to look at the big picture. Like, look at, all right, where is your time? What days do you have time? Like, look at your schedule. And for somebody like Wes, if you have 3 days where you have a good chunk of time that you can commit to training, then maybe a 3-day program. I know other people who have struggled with time, and they actually increase the frequency so they can get it done. Maybe like instead of going 4 days a week, they go 5, but they just do like 1 or 2 exercises, and they get it done in 45 minutes. So it all just comes down to your schedule and what you can fit in. For me, I kind of implemented at first. Well, at first I tried to see if I could just do it the good old-fashioned way of just sticking with it, and I fell off pretty fast. Because I had bad habits, because I just like to be in the gym. So I'd need to be on my phone, I'd be talking to people, I would just be resting longer than I needed to. So I think that is one thing you can do, is just like break those habits and try to create new habits. Like, you don't need to rest 10 minutes between sets of 5 at RP 8 or 7. You can cut that down to 2 or 1, 2, 3 minutes. You don't need a lot of time. It might be hard at first, but you can adapt to it. So that's one thing I found is that you don't need as much rest as you think you need. And if you analyze the time you're spending in the gym, not all of it's productive. So try to make all the time that you're in the gym productive. But one thing I did after I figured out that 3 hours, 4 days a week wasn't going to work was kind of implement like a flex training program where, kind of like Jackson was saying, I'd have, all right, here's my required days or required lifts, stuff I need to hit to be successful. And then I had basically optional stuff. And I could also just move the scheduling around, because my first block of school, it was very inconsistent when I had time. Like, sometimes I'd have class 8 to 5 and I needed to study. Other days I'd have class from 8 to noon or 8 to 3 and have a block of time. So it just kind of moved around. So you have to be flexible with your scheduling.
Yeah, definitely. The one interesting kind of realization that I had throughout, especially that style of training, is how important, the bigger picture is as far as training goes compared to a single session. I used to, and still do, like, I really appreciate having a fantastic day at the gym, where I did everything I was supposed to. Everything felt great. I hit my RPE exactly. I estimated my, intensity for that day. But one thing as far as like a mindset is knowing that, okay, as long as I can get the same amount of volume in the week, then it's a successful training week, and you do that, even if, like I said, if it's 2 weeks or if it's, or 2 days or 5 days of training, and seeing it, okay, both this week was a success because I did what I needed to. For me, that was huge, especially from my mental health standpoint. Because like you said, I love being in the gym, always have loved it. So when you have a 2-day training week, you can look at that and say, man, that was a really crappy training week, but not really if I did everything I was supposed to.
Yeah, I think big picture, it just comes back to compliance. There's not a single way or the right way in which you should train. When you're on a time crunch, there's multiple ways you can manipulate your training, but just find something that you can stick to that still allows you to train. And again, just something you can actually comply with. Because sometimes stuff looks really good on paper, but your life is just really hectic and crazy, and you can't comply with most of those days, then it's probably not a fantastic strategy for that period in time in your life. So trying to figure out a way to continue to train, but in a way that you can stick to.
I think so. Step one, you need to do like a needs analysis. Like, what are your goals? If it's power, for us, it's all strength training and powerlifting. So it's pretty simple for us. We need to do the competition lifts or something close to it, and then other things are kind of like extra credit. So some of those other things, like bicep curls and like other stuff that may not be as important for our goals as they are for other people's, may go by the wayside. So see what's important to you, and then program the most important things for that with the time you have. One thing I think is super useful for when you're on a time crunch is auto-regulated training, and not everybody does that. So using RPE to kind of gauge your sessions allows you to take advantage of the time you do have and take advantage of like the good days you have, and also pull back when life gets in the way, because it's not just a time thing too. When you're super busy or you got a kid or you got school, it's not just time, it's also stress. You got a final coming up. You didn't get any sleep last night because your baby was crying, or because you're up all night studying, whatever it is. When that life stress gets too high, you have to be able to pull back in your training and then kind of like ride the ebbs and flows of it. And I think auto-regulated training allows you to do that really well.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. And then another thing that I kind of auto-regulate as well is going back to that checklist. If I said I have to squat twice a week, then I'll have one competition squat, and then I'll choose a variation, but that variation depending on my time for the next session. So if I can competition squat twice, maybe I'll do that. But like yesterday I had 0 time. And so I did a beltless, sleeveless safety bar squat with a 1.5 minute break in between, you know? And so that completely changes what I would have considered in my programming, because I was like, all right, I have 30 minutes, you know? And I knew that taking my belt on and off, getting my sleeves on, and, you know, getting the rack completely set the way it needed to be would take longer than just getting underneath the safety bar and going. So there's a bunch of different things that you can auto-regulate just for me based on time. You know, RPE is fantastic. And exercise selection can be, dependent on what you're training for, can be a huge variable that you can play with as well.
I also think that people tend to spend more useless time in the gym than needed, like I said, and not just in the gym too. Like if you have 4 hours of free time during the day, the rest is filled up by school, by kids, by whatever, by work, but part of that 4 hours you spend browsing Facebook or just laying down. Like, you also have to organize some of the rest of that free time or some of your life around training. If you want to optimize training, or not optimize, but if you want to do well in training, you have to dedicate some time to it. And then also just find out what you're doing. If you spend 30 minutes to warm up in the gym but are complaining about time, then maybe that should be the first thing to be abbreviated.
I think one thing that I found useful, and for anyone who's a student out there, you might try it and see if it works. It was during those capped rest periods that I had over 3 minutes. I have to do a lot of reading for articles, so I'd read like a paragraph of an article or something like that. So I'd have an article, and I'd probably get through 2 articles throughout one of my training sessions, so it's still useful. And there's still a little bit of downtime, but it kind of helps. Like if you really have a lot to do and you're just like, oh, I can't train today because I have to read or study, you know, potentially try using those rest periods rather than talking to other individuals, even though the gym can be a fun social environment. If you have to, you know, study or read, try to use those set rest periods as, you know, time to be productive as well. It may or may not work, but I found it useful just because I have to do a lot of reading. So
That's actually really funny. I did something similar, but I would make sure that I had no music on in the gym, because I found sitting there just in silence waiting for your next set, it makes that 3 minutes seem extremely long compared to like sitting there, you know, talking to friends, listening to music. Yeah. But when I'm the only one at the gym at, you know, either 6 a.m. or 9 o'clock at night, no music, it just kind of drives you a little bit crazy, and you want to get under the bar again and just get it done. Yeah. And so there's, like Wes said, that's a great way to do it, you know, is reading. Or I have a client who we make them, you know, walk across the gym and touch the wall, walk back to squat rack, walk back and touch the wall, and then they do their next set again. Just because like they get so like caught up in conversation that if I don't give them something to do, then they kind of go crazy a little bit, or we'll lose track of time because they're really good at holding a conversation. Mm-hmm. So that's what we do. They finish their set, walk down, touch the wall, come back, walk down again, touch the wall, come back. So there's a bunch of different strategies that you can use to reduce the amount of time that you're wasting in the gym.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, I would read articles or listen to podcasts or something. Something school related, but sometimes sometimes I also think it's important not to do that.
Yeah, I agree.
Because especially for people like us who training is kind of a big part of our life, it's important to get out of that headspace for a while and just focus on the task at hand. And I think that's sometimes the healthiest thing to do. And if you can't find 45 minutes or an hour and a half at some point during the week, then like something's not right. So you should always find time for you as well. So
depending, you know, if you are a competitive powerlifter, Olympic lifter or whatever, maybe not Olympic lifter, but, you know, powerlifter, bodybuilder, whatever, depending on the block that you're into, if you structure your training in blocks, one thing that I found useful in higher volume blocks was to implement things like myo reps or drop sets. It's just another thing for time, just because at that point in time, you know, effort and lifting in somewhat close proximity to failure is useful. And so they have like one activation set, take it, you know, basically to failure, and then rest a few breaths and then do it again until you get to a bottom range of whatever you say is acceptable until you move on to the next exercise. And so stuff like that's useful too. Again, it just depends on the block. That might not be useful if you're, you know, in a strength block or something like that, but can be. So it's just another strategy.
Yeah, just find little things to save time, like supersets, mile reps, like density training, like just putting some time on the clock to do something and just go for it, or try to do a certain amount of reps and as many or as least amount of sets as possible in a certain given period of time. Just be creative. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just your training. So anything else, guys?
One thing with that style of training that has been actually really beneficial is my conditioning level has gone up quite a bit, and I don't have to implement conditioning, because when the majority of it is, if I give myself that hour ticking clock and I have to move from exercise to exercise, and then all of my accessory stuff, I do myo reps just because I can get done with an accessory movement in no time. And for me at this moment, I'm not doing any, it's more just a general block. So it's been really useful to do that. But if you train that way, it's amazing what it'll do for your conditioning. Whereas before you sit around for 5 minutes and for, like you said, a triple at RPE 8, you don't need that much time.
Yeah. That's interesting too, because like, so maybe it's not, I mean, maybe it's more healthy to just reframe instead of saying I have no time or whatever. It's like, okay, I have limited time, but maybe I can train something different for a little while. Maybe my training focus can change. Like maybe this amount of time that you don't have is for a semester or whatever. Mm-hmm. Just focus on something different. At the end of the day, it's not going to affect your training that much in the long run.
Yeah.
Like view it as a positive.
Yeah. Sometimes reframing your perspective is useful. I also think even in times like this, that sometimes it is frustrating to have to alter your training for the sake of time. Sometimes there's actually a psychological benefit of just novelty, like, oh, this is new, I haven't done this in a while, and so sometimes that is nice, at least for a period of time, to try something different. But yeah, I'd say for a lot of people who really love lifting and that's kind of how they identify as a lifter, it can be a huge psychological tool to have to really alter your training. But I wouldn't use it, like Shannon said, as a negative. Try to find some sort of a positive perspective out of it, and then just keep training.
Yeah. I think that covers this topic pretty well. If you have any questions or would like some advice on trying to save your time in the gym, don't hesitate to shoot us or either of us a message or comment on YouTube, on Instagram, wherever else we post this podcast. And then just like at the beginning of this podcast, we'll try to get to your questions on the next podcast. All right, this has been a Like Iron production. Like Iron podcast, no longer TLP. We'll miss the name, but maybe we'll get a few more listeners.
Yeah.
Peace.